Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Observe It podcast. Really excited to welcome Kevin Lin to our show today. Kevin is a fellow founder in this Seattle area. Welcome, Kevin. Please introduce yourself to our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thanks, Daniela, and excited to be here. So, my background, I'm an engineer. I started off working at AWS. I was working on the load balancing side. So that was back when it was elastic load balancing, and then now it's application load balancing, network load balancing. Worked on scaling and availability, and also did some stints at other AWS teams and other parts around Amazon. Left after 5 years, did some independent consulting, and did some startups, and eventually led to me doing my own startup. This originally was in the developer tooling space. So it was Dendron was the company. We were making an open source Notion competitor that was focused on developers and developer teams and integrated with IDE. We had a lot of good traction. We went through YC, we raised seed round for it, but ultimately had a hard time taking it up market to teams and enterprise. We made something that was very good for power users, but not so great for a wider audience. And trying to sell it, I described it as trying to sell Vim to the enterprise, or users who loved using Dendron really got it, but it was hard to get it into like a VC compatible business. And so about 6 months ago, we did a major pivot, and now working back in the infrastructure space, new company, Nimbus. We're focused on essentially optimizing people's observability costs. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that in this podcast. So I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, so let's jump right into it. I'm interested in the pivot, right? So, what made you focus eventually on this specific area on observability costs? What motivated that?
Yeah, so in terms of why observability, I think it was after working on Dendron for 2.5 to 3 years. We were working on a product that I was personally passionate about, but realized that we didn't really have a clear indication of what was the market. Honestly, it's something I should have probably thought more about before going into it. And so during the pivot, it was very much thinking about, okay, what is a product that I think I can work on for the next 10 years, that there is also a significant market for. And that initially led me to infrastructure. The trend is that cloud infrastructure is big of a market as it is today. It is still growing. I forget what the latest Gartner report was, but it's like 20-30% of people who could be on cloud are actually on cloud. And so the initial idea was to actually go into the infra space. And then, essentially before building a product, interviewed 100 companies on essentially problems in that space. The initial idea was, hey, let's build something that's like AWS, but easier to use, because AWS is like C++, and most people want something more like Python. And kind of realizing from talking to a bunch of people that the people who do want to use AWS are interested in kind of like the low-level abstractions, and the people that don't are already using something like Vercel. It's kind of going to be awkward to build something that's like in the middle. Plus, there were also a bunch of other companies moving in the space. And then just by happenstance, every person, or most of the people that we did talk to about infrastructure did mention on the side, by the way, we have a huge observability bill, and this is a real drag, and what was interesting about that is that was a common theme among both seed stage startups to enterprise Fortune 500 companies. And so essentially it was something that came out of interviews of, hey, this seemed to be a problem. Plus, I used to work on observability back when I was in AWS on the load balancing side. And so let's follow that thread and see where it leads.
Got it. And then what's one interesting or what's the most interesting piece of fact that you found out about cost around observability? I know you have lots of opinions, but what's something that you feel like most people don't know?
Yeah, so where to start? So observability costs, the way that it is described observability costs today is kind of like, if you remember back in the day when texting first became a thing, and you had to pay 10 cents per text message. And it was absolutely ridiculous because that was 100x the price of the actual bytes. You're just sending little bits of bytes. But because it's this new thing, telco carriers could charge this ridiculous markup for it. And I feel like for observability, we're kind of in the same space. At the end of the day, observability data is just bytes. And if you measure bytes in terms of what does it take to store bytes, let's say on the cloud, like the baseline is something like S3 object store. It's around 2 cents per gigabyte. And yes, that's kind of like on the low end of the spectrum. But then if you look at vendors like Datadog, so one thing is the pricing is kind of complicated because different vendors have different SKUs, but you can usually normalize to gigabytes per month. And Datadog, they do something a little different. They charge by millions of events, so $1.70 per million events. But if you make some reasonable assumptions of how big an event is, let's say like 512 kilobytes per event on the big side, it comes out anywhere between $3 to $6 a gigabyte. And so if you just compare that to how much would it cost to store like this byte on S3, which is 2 cents, and then how much would it cost for these more expensive vendors like Datadog, where you can go up to $6 or more, there is over 100x difference. And I think that was the thing that really drew me into this space is where was the discrepancy coming from, and why is it that when you store these bytes in an observability vendor that they become over 100x more expensive than storing it yourself?
So do you think that Datadog is actually, upcharging, 100x more? Or are there other costly components in the system that?
Yeah, so I mean, definitely there's tons of additional cost, and this is a very simplified view of let's just look at how much it costs to store it. There is also the user experience, which Datadog especially is very famous for. Single pane of glass, everything is well integrated. Being able to index everything, being able to query everything in a millisecond or a second. So there's a lot more that goes into it, but I would not say like it's 100x more. And the nice thing about companies like Datadog, which are public, is you can actually see their margins in their financial reports. Like Datadog makes 80% margins on the services that they sell. And whether if this is all like upselling on the difference between, and so I guess to reverse that, the margin is coming from the difference in them managing your data and how much you're paying for that data. So while it's, there's more to it than just simply storing it, it is still vastly less than what they are charging you.
Got it. So, they maintain healthy margins.
Yes.
When we talk about observability, it sounds like you're talking about events, which is focused on logging. Am I correct?
Yes. So logging has been right now for my company our primary focus, but you could make it's the same in the metric space, because if you look at how most vendors charge for metrics, it's usually something per series, like per metric, and then you have additional charge per label or per combination of labels. And in some ways, that's even more egregious because it's very much on if you, depending on what labels you attach to the same metric, the number of metrics, the cardinality of those label values. Essentially, you do multiplication on the bytes times price times cardinality. When at the end of the day, if you compare that to, for example, using Prometheus and an S3 backend, there's no difference in how much it costs to store multiple series. And you actually see AWS of all people getting into that space with their managed Prometheus service, where there's not an active series charge. There is just a charge on the number of data points you sent. And so I would say you see similar discrepancies in terms of pricing in the other signals as well. But for us, we've been primarily focused on logging just as it's something that we're more familiar with. and gives us a good place to start from, because it tends to be the area where a lot of companies have budgeting issues around.
Yeah, and it gets really expensive. Have you looked at other companies as well? Like Splunk is, I guess, another popular vendor for like log insights and log queries.
Yes. So, I mean, the observability space is, I'm sure you're also aware of, is very big and crowded. There's lots of players. The big ones: Splunk, Datadog, New Relic, and then lots of upstarts. And so there's Honeycomb. I mean, Grafana Cloud is a big one. Sumo Logic. There's a lot of acquisitions nowadays, so they're kind of becoming more consolidated. But I would say like all the observability vendors that started maybe 10 years ago that are big today, when we talk about logging, they all charge, like New Relic is probably right now the most reasonable of the bunch, and they're around 30 cents per gigabyte. But that's kind of like the lower end of that tier.
Got it. I mean, I also think with margins, you don't fix something that ain't broken, right? There hasn't been any disruption, so there's no need to drive the price down. So then talk to me a little bit about sort of your key insight here, and your differentiator with Nimbus. What angle are you coming at it as? Is it a cost angle? Is it just like way cheaper than all the other solutions?
Yeah, so this has been an interesting journey. So initially, when we were going into observability, it was kind of at that angle of, if we start today in 2020, building a modern observability stack and doing it in a cloud native way, so we decouple the storage from the compute, we can scale both independently. Like, how much would that cost? What would that look like? And it led us to build a model that was essentially backed by S3, fronted by a Trino cluster. And we proved out to ourselves that, we could use this sort of setup to query like data sets of tens to hundreds of terabytes in still single digit milliseconds, and give like, it's not exactly the same as a Datadog experience, but it basically got the job done. And then we took this to companies and basically made this proposition of like, how would you like to place your logging stack and eventually also your metric and tracing stack with or solution, which can be 70 times cheaper than what you're currently paying today. And the interesting thing we got from that is basically talking to 100 companies. Anybody that was using Datadog or another vendor, everybody complained about the price. Nobody wanted to switch. And the reason for that is sunk cost. Like, you've already invested all this engineering team and effort into instrumenting and learning how to use the tools. And, if you do this migration, in the best possible case, you make the migration and nothing changes. And that's not going to be the case, because at the end of the day, like, especially Datadog, they have a phenomenal developer experience, and nobody else can replicate that. So you would actually be going to a worse experience. And so no company wanted to do that, even in these economic times. And instead, what we found is what people did is they had engineers cut logs, cut metrics, decide just, hey, we're just not going to have observability on these systems, but so they can continue using the tools that they did. And, we thought about it, and we could, it was definitely still viable to build essentially an observability vendor on kind of like these, essentially this new cost structure. And there are companies that do this. Some prominent ones are like Axiom, CoralLogix, Observe. But we decided that we didn't want to go into that fight because it seemed more of like a race to the bottom. And I think eventually like that will be kind of how people will do this. It's not necessary. It wasn't a race that we wanted to be in. And so instead, what we ended up focusing on is what I've been calling basically optimizing your existing observability. So looking at what people do today and giving you better tools to do it. So we know that engineers are already cutting logs at the end of the month. So why don't we give you visibility into that? We essentially give you analytics into, what are your most common logs? What is used? What isn't used? How can you aggregate it, compress it, reduce it, filter it, have metrics around that, and have safety railings around that, so you can do that more effectively. And this kind of slowly led to us building out the Nimbus product line, which instead of being an observability vendor ourselves, I describe this more as an optimization engine for your existing observability stack. And so we plug in basically at the agent level. So like, for example, if you're using Datadog, instead of sending your data to Datadog directly, you would change that endpoint to send data to Nimbus. We would analyze it, optimize it along the way, and then send the optimized log output to Datadog. And through this process, we're able to essentially reduce your log volume or your billable volume by anywhere between 60 and 90% without actually losing any of your data in the process.
Interesting. So you guys are a drop-in replacement then for the DD agent, the actual agent that's...
So we don't, well, we could be. Today, the primary way people use us is we act as an aggregator. So the DD agent, instead of sending logs to Datadog, they would send to our endpoint and we would proxy it to Datadog.
Got it. But essentially, it is just deploying this as some kind of a service or sidecar. Is it deployed as a separate service inside the customer's VPC?
There's multiple options. So right now, it's either you can deploy or you can essentially ship to our cloud endpoint, in which case there's no setup for you besides changing the config on your DD agent, or it can run as a deployment inside of your own VPC.
Okay, that's cool. So you're kind of an observability that observes your observability, right? It's very meta.
Basically, we're a meta observability tool. And the idea here is also kind of getting back to the, like, we thought about building an observability vendor, but then it's like, what we were really competing on at that point was price, and this race to the bottom. And kind of thinking about like the reason why people buy into observability vendors at the end of the day is not so you can store tons of telemetry data and pay Datadog lots of money. It's that fundamentally at the end of the day, you want insights for your business. You want to make sure that your services are up, they're performant, your customers are not suffering downtime. If there are issues, that you can investigate it more quickly. And this is why, like, we came at this of, you already have all this data and everybody will help you store this data. But like, moving forward, I don't think storing this data is really where the value is going to come from. Like, I think that is more of a commodity kind of space where you will find a vendor that will store your data, but that's not where the value comes from. The value comes from how do you make use of that data, and how can potentially tools and services help you with that? And right now, kind of where we come in right now is, well, you can't make use of the data if you can't afford it. And so there's this very obvious play of, hey, plug us in, we help you save 60% of your Datadog bill. But then moving forward, because we're already processing all your telemetry, all your signals, it's just, and we're already doing this, is getting into like, okay, like, can we make sure that your data is actually in a good shape? Because if it's not, it's garbage in, garbage out. So in the Datadog case, for example, it's making sure that the logs that you have, are the error levels actually classified correctly so that Datadog can actually mark them as errors versus it just shows up as a random property. Making sure, Datadog, for example, you can correlate your logs and traces, but that's only if you have a proper trace ID tag in your logs. And so making sure that's properly correlated. So starting to add, this is kind of like the beginning, but this idea of helping you, now that you have all this telemetry data, how do we deploy it in a usable form for your team to consume and make use of?
Got it. And you're starting with Datadog. I'm guessing that there's a lot more on the horizon.
Yes. Technically, we support basically any vendor. I like to just say Datadog just because it's the one that most people are familiar with. And it tends to be the one where people have like the highest bills. Like, we currently have customers that spend more on Datadog than they spend on their compute infrastructure. And that's not actually that uncommon.
Interesting. Yeah, I tend to think of observability costs as a target of single-digit percentage of your total infra cost. That's kind of a good ideal to have.
Yeah, I think I've seen it all across the board. I know, like, I think right now, like, a popular one in the industry is the Honeycomb published standard of, like, aim it for like 20 to 30%. It can vary, but I would say like 30% should be like the high point. It should not be over. It should not be 50% or 100%.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. 20%, I mean, personally, I still feel like that's very high, but again, it honestly really depends on the value that the tool is providing the developers in return.
Yeah, and I mean the other additional thing, I mean, like to me, it's also high, but I think it also comes from like the place of having run like Prometheus and Elasticsearch and these observability stacks and knowing kind of like base cost of that. I think for most companies where, and you having gone through Lightstep and now running your own infra company, like I think for customers that are not in the business of infrastructure or in the business of observability, it is pretty like in that case, it is pretty reasonable to say that, hey, we're gonna essentially rely on a third party vendor, and part of the kind of fee that you're paying there is this institutional knowledge of knowing how to scale your observability backend.
Yeah. How are you thinking about pricing? Is it always like as a proportional to the amount of savings you're able to bring, or is there some fixed cost?
We're still experimenting with the pricing model. Right now, what we have been pricing on is based on the amount of data ingested. So essentially gigabytes ingested per month. And we find that that's pretty reasonable. And generally, it's also pretty easy for our customers to take because the cost of using Nimbus with Datadog or whatever their observability vendor is tends to be still like generally half of what they were paying before with just using Datadog.
Got it. Makes sense. I think we've sort of talked enough to fill up like a pretty good episode. I want to sort of ask you to maybe wrap up with sort of one final thing for our viewers and listeners. Like, what is a key insight or a key question that you want people listening to be thinking about or to be taking away from today's conversation?
One thing I will point out, I think when a lot of people kind of take a look at their observability data, especially for logging, I think everyone knows it's like, we could optimize this better. I think I get this from everyone I talk to. It's like, yeah, we know our logs could be better optimized, but we haven't gotten to that. And I think a key fear people have in optimizing logs is just, what if I need it? What if I run into that one incident where that one log line from that one random system turns out to be the key of resolving this entire incident? And the thing is, you can do both. You can optimize your logs and you can keep all of your data. I think this is what has led to us being able to sign up customers pretty rapidly, is because what we do is essentially we don't actually filter out your data. That's not, instead what we focus on is we focus on data aggregation. So let's say you have tons of logs, but they all have the same like transaction ID. Then if they do that, then you can basically treat it like a trace. And what we can do is we can essentially compact all those logs into one log event. So instead of having 100 separate log events, you have one log with 100 subfields. Like that's an example. Or if you have, tons of logs that are just 200 OK, and you don't want to drop it, you can still aggregate it all together into like a minute interval. And so you just have like 100 timestamps, but that's like 200 OK. So I would say like that's one common way of starting to optimize your logs, where you can do that without losing any data. And this works especially well for vendors that charge based on the number of events, because you could technically send your entire log volume as long as you shape it in a way that it's very fat logs, like a few number of fat logs versus a lot of very skinny logs.
Got it. Yeah. Almost like compression in a way, right?
It is.
Like if you know sort of the shape of the original data, then you can compress it a lot better because you understand the schema of it.
Exactly. And the idea there is just, you don't have to make a trade-off. You can optimize your logs without losing visibility and still get a 60% savings.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It reminds me of a conversation that I was having with Ben Siegelman on the last episode, where I insisted that I feel like there's more developer education needed, because you have the sort of cost optimizers, or oftentimes the buyers and economic decision makers looking at the observability costs and wanting to kind of come down with a big fat hammer and reduce retention, or do a bunch of really drastic things to cut down Datadog or observability billing. And then you have the developers and engineers who are in the mindset that you mentioned, which is, what if I'm in the middle of an incident and this is the one thing? It's kind of like buying insurance. You want it there. And I had said that, well, if you could educate the developers more at the time of writing the code or instrumenting, then they know the implications of what they're doing, and perhaps they could do better. But I really like your approach, because again, it takes a burden away from the developers and tries to be smart and tries to automate a lot of this, so that the developers don't have to think about aggregating at the time of development. But you're sort of just doing it transparently for them while achieving the same results.
Yep, that's basically our pitch. So,
Yeah.
thank you for re-articulating it.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's very exciting for sure, and the space, like I said, is very near and dear to my heart. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Kevin, and thank you everybody for tuning in and watching and listening.
Yeah, thanks. I had fun. Thanks for having me.